Hi, friends. My name's Bea Moorhead. I'm Texas Impact's Executive Director. I'm not quite the expert at moderating Zoom panels that Scott is, but I'm going to do my best here. I want to welcome you to the final session of Texas Impact's Faith in Democracy, Lifting Dallas Voices for Justice. This is the second in a series of conversations that we've been having throughout the state this summer and fall, featuring faith and community leaders, advocates, and Texas Impact staff, talking about the importance of Texans of faith participating in the policy process and discussing nuts and bolts strategies on how you and your congregation can be effective participants in democracy, working to ensure safe and accountable voting this election season and effectively advocating as we move toward the 2021 Texas legislative session. For those unfamiliar with Texas Impact, we're the state's oldest and largest interfaith network. We're a membership organization, and if today's event inspires you to get more involved, we hope you'll consider joining, and hopefully one of my colleagues is dropping the link for you to go to join in the chat as we speak. Texas Impact exists to put faith into action. We equip faith leaders and their congregations with the information, opportunities, and outreach tools to educate their communities and engage with lawmakers on pressing public policy issues. We help people live out their faith in the public square, moving the faith community from charity to justice. Communities of faith have a heritage of service. We engage in direct acts of compassion toward the most vulnerable members of our communities. While we recognize our calling to be the hands and feet that serve our neighbors, we also believe collectively we can make a broader impact by changing public policy. That's where Texas Impact steps in. So this panel is going to be a little bit different from the other three. For one thing, we are not broadcasting on Facebook Live. Also, we're not going to have PowerPoint. We're going to have a conversation instead. And we're not talking about voting particularly, although I bet it will come up. But we're going to be talking with Beeman Floyd and Josh Houston. Josh Houston, you may know, is Texas Impact's Advocacy Director. Beeman Floyd, you may or may not know, is our outside legislative counsel. And Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you if you have a little bit of framing that you want to inject to get us started. And then you're welcome to introduce Beeman when you're done having your say. The last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Josh is you'll see at the bottom of your screen, you have a chat box and you also have Q&A. And what Scott has guided us to say is that we're using the chat box kind of like a water cooler discussion place. If you have just stuff you want to say, comments, questions, go ahead and plunk them in the chat box. If you have questions that you want one of the speakers, Josh or Beeman, to answer for everybody, go ahead and put it in the Q&A and we'll get to it when we get to the Q&A portion. And we've got here a question already that says, can we post again from the last session the link to go check to see if you're registered to vote? And the answer is yes, we can post that. I bet Scott or somebody can do that right now. But right now I'm gonna turn it over to Josh to make some opening remarks and introduce Beeman.
Hi, good to be back with you. If you were in the last panel, if not, I'm Joshua Houston. It's a pleasure to be here. The last three panels, we talked about voting. Voting determines what's gonna happen next. Next being the legislative session that starts the second Tuesday of January in an odd numbered year and will run for 140 days throughout that period. So in this panel, what you're going to have is the three registered lobbyists for the organization, me, myself, Beeman, and Bea. And I'd just like to thank you for being here. We're not an organization that has money for campaign contributions. We do not endorse candidates. We do not litigate. What we have is you, people who are engaged and people who vote. So if you did not know before today that your faith community has a lobbyist, it's a pleasure to meet you on behalf of all three of us. And for those of you who are a little more familiar but want to know, well, how is it you're lobbying on my behalf? Our legislative agenda is created by our board of directors. We actually do not appoint choose our board of directors. Our board of directors is appointed to us by our denominational members of Texas Impact. They will get together here at the end of this month to talk about the legislative agenda for the next 2 years. And then they set that agenda as a consensus agenda. It's things that they all agree on whether they're Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, and it will not conflict with any of the positions of the national denominations. So that's kind of how we get what we get. We spend almost all year every day equipping members to build relationships with their elected officials, their lawmakers, their representation. We try to give you timely info about the policy issues that our faith communities care about as that information arises. And during the session, we are closely monitoring 6,500 bills in 140 days. And provide opportunities to mobilize you to advocate and lobby on those specific bills. And in all these activities, we depend on guidance from those in the Capitol community, other lobbyists who have other relationships and other information we don't have. That building runs on information. And so this next session is going to be really weird if we cannot get in the building and bump into each other in the hallways and in the cafeteria and chat with one another. So there's a lot we don't know, not just how the virus will come out, but politically how the November election is going to come out. But there are some things we do know. One of the folks that we rely on especially to give us that kind of information is our good Presbyterian friend Beeman Floyd, who has been our legislative consultant for more than 15 years. Texas Impact, our board, highly relies on Beeman to provide a depth of policy knowledge and incisive situational analysis, which we then use to mobilize Texans of faith to be effective in their advocacy. So we're very glad he's agreed to join us today and share some of the insights of what's coming up for the 87th after all the votes are counted and the 87th legislature seated in January. So Beeman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Josh. And it's always a pleasure to talk to the people of faith who are interested in justice and policy and the link between those things. It's also a pleasure to work with y'all. It's a labor of love because it's good work and fun work to do this at the Capitol. My name is Beeman Floyd. I am a professional legislative consultant and lobbyist here down here in Austin, Texas. I guess there's a lot to say about what's going on right now in Texas vis-a-vis policy. And I guess I'd like to start with a little bit of a structural framework to sort of pare down those things into something that is understandable, I guess, for me, and hopefully by extension for you guys. The first thing that I would say, and I think this is very important, there are three branches of government. The judicial, the legislative, and the executive. You guys all know this from my wife is a high school government teacher, so she hopes that you all know this. One of the things that has been very strange about this experience that we've had in Texas since March is that the legislative branch of government has not been in session. The legislative branch of government in Texas only meets once every 2 years. They'll be meeting this January. And they don't have a constitutional means to convene themselves. They can only be convened between normal legislative sessions by the governor. The governor has not seen fit, has not been asked in a big way to, or he has been asked, but not in a compelling political way, to convene the legislative session for a special session or extraordinary session. And so what you have seen so far in terms of a governmental response to what has been going on in Texas, both directly from COVID and indirectly, on all the indirect effects of COVID, has been executive branch and judicial response. You might have seen some legislative commentary on COVID, but you haven't seen an actual legislative policy response to COVID and the economic dislocation associated with COVID. This is an important thing to remember because we are coming up on a constitutionally mandated legislative session in January. So in the same way that the legislature can't meet in extraordinary session except with permission of the governor cannot stop the legislature from meeting in January. The Constitution says that they have the right to convene, that they must convene, and that they have the right to keep meeting for 140 days. And so that is coming up. And I think it's important to remember, because you all have to remember that though the legislative branch has been largely silent during the COVID crisis, it is going to be a critical feature of how we actually respond to the crisis. And because of Texas' peculiar biennial legislative pattern, other states have had legislatures in session during the COVID crisis. Texas has yet to do that. And so my first admonition to you all as people of faith who are paying attention to policy is be mindful of the fact that the legislative session is coming, but also be mindful of the fact that your legislators have not had any authority whatsoever to transact record business during COVID. So if you are frustrated that the legislature has been silent, you might be frustrated at their lack of commentary, but you can't be frustrated by their lack of action because they have no facility to act at this point. The second thing is that constitutionally, it's going to happen. So notwithstanding the fact that they've been very quiet and haven't been able to act, they will be. And so take this opportunity to go and talk to them about things that are important to you. Obviously, part of your talking is voting, and you've been talking about that for a lot of the day. But the other part of your talking is talking about what's important to you, talking about the framework of policy that you think is relevant and important to your communities, both those things that are directly associated with the current crises that are facing Texas, and those things that are ongoing relevant issues that we've been talking about for periods of years. And so take this opportunity to talk to your legislators. I'll pause there. Do any of my co-panelists have a question or comment about that so far? All right. The second thing that we need to understand about the upcoming legislative session is that because of the particularity of the COVID crisis, we are going into it in a way that is really unprecedented. Typically what happens during the interim is that the legislature, though it cannot meet and vote and pass laws, what it can do is meet in interim committees and adopt recommendations and pass motions that are recommendations to the coming legislature. What that has really turned into throughout the course of Texas history in Texas politics is there's a huge amount of interim activity that is framing activity for the legislative session. So the interim starts with the presiding officers, the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor, issuing committee charges. That is, they issue recommendations of what the committee should focus on between the end of the last session and the coming legislative session. And then there are typically many meetings. Each committee will have 3 or 4 or 5 meetings where they look at those interim charges, their record hearings, people sign up and testify under oath at those hearings. The committees at the end of the day will adopt a committee report that is a recommendation based on all of that advocacy. So under ordinary circumstances, we at Texas Impact and you as grassroots participants and as grass tops participants and as community representatives would have potentially signed up, testified under oath, provided written materials, provided research, gone to committee members and said, hey, have you looked at this? And what's your input gonna be on the committee report? All of these things. None of this is happening. And it's not happening because the legislature can't do anything. And the reason the legislature can't do anything is because the Constitution of 1876 did not anticipate COVID, although they had their share of pandemics back in the day, but they also didn't anticipate the facility to be able to meet virtually. And so what that means is that the legislature doesn't have any rules that can support virtual hearings that are record hearings with testimony and people taking oaths and those kinds of things. The parliamentarians of the House wrote a fairly comprehensive letter where they said, we can't have virtual hearings during the interim. We don't have that facility. So as long as the Capitol is closed, as long as COVID is preventing in a practical way that we have in-person public hearings, we can't have any hearings. We can have information sessions, we can have some town hall type meetings. The committees can solicit information on their various charges from stakeholders, but we can't actually have hearings where people are held to account in that particular way and cross-examined and what we do. This is important. It's important because part of that process is that you refine ideas during the interim so that they have a little bit, they're tuned up a little bit more, I guess, for efficient disposition during the legislative session. You learn in the interim what's important. You learn in the interim who really knows what they're talking about and who doesn't. You learn during the interim which ideas really have a lot of support, legs, as we call it, which ones have legs that are really going to run far into the legislative session. You just really get a lot of data during the interim, and we're not getting any of that right now, which is super interesting because it's really like flying on instruments. And really not being able to see the normal things that you can see as you move toward a legislative session. Let me pause there and see if you all have anything to say or to add to that. Unmute, B.
Sorry. I think I would just add that one of the ways that organizations like Texas Impact, so not just Texas Impact, but most of the groups we work with on issues, use the interim process also as a way to kind of check the temperature as we're moving. So during those hearings is when people start to hear what are gonna be the arguments that come up, who are the people who we should get to know now and all that. So all of the public interest advocacy community is kind of having to, I guess you're right, fly blind, or I was going to say we're having to cook without a thermometer. We can't really tell what we're going to need, where we're going to need to be by January at this point.
Right. Yeah, I have two concerns about it. The first being, I, as a policy lobbyist, not one that does the wining and dining or the campaign contributions, do my work by engaging with the staff on the interim charges throughout the 18 months they're not in session. So I've not been able to meet the new staff people because the turnover, especially on the House side, is quite extensive. So I'll be working off a Rolodex or not a Rolodex, but a cell phone, cell phone numbers and relationships that are 2 years old. And then I have a second concern on policy because, yeah, I can submit written stuff, but I cannot go talk to that staffer. I cannot make sure that they really know what's most important in a 20-page report on vote by mail. It's got to be done by phone. It has to be set up and coordinated. So those are just some of the challenges that I know Texas Impact will be facing, and every lobbyist has challenges, but some of the specific ones to us.
Yeah, those are good points. It's funny, there are all kinds of theories about this right now. There's one theory that says policy lobbyists are actually going to have an advantage because there's not wining and dining right now. One of the theories is that policy lobbyists are sunk because now it's just dueling, almost like direct mail into the legislature, and it's not sometimes there's nothing like being in the same room with everybody that creates a sense of intellectual accountability. If you're in the room and somebody else gets up and says essentially you're full of it, they have to face you to say that, right? Whereas if everybody's just mailing in their stuff, you're not having a conversation. You're not having a dialectical exercise. What you're having is just everybody sends stuff, and then whoever receives it, and you don't know what happens, right? You can obviously do some things about this. I mean, part of what people like me are doing is creating virtual contingency plans, right? Where you get a whole lot of, where you start sort of getting legislative staffers into the concept of joining you for Zoom meetings, where you can actually have a conversation to the extent that that's possible on Zoom, where you collect a lot of information about how to get to people and start segmenting that into chunks where you can communicate quickly that way. And so we're populating the world with clever spreadsheets on all of the information that we need to be able to set up something that is an intensely in-person thing and see how much of that we can do virtually. A lot of people who do what I do are also getting computers with really big screens and more than one of them to set up in your office so that you can, instead of the physical act of walking from one committee room to another, which you do all day long during the legislative session, because we'll have things going on in different places at different times. You'll have to be able to see it all happening at once. And so, that's shop talk, but the bottom line is that, and I will say this, and I've said it to all the people I work with and certainly all my clients, I don't know what's going on. But anybody who tells you they do know what's going on is actually lying to you. Mm-hmm. Because it's, this is really, as we say, very much unprecedented. And there are, in addition to the issue, relative to the issue of COVID, and then also separate from it, are a discrete set of uncertainties. One of them is COVID itself. We're about to do the big experiment in Texas, where we are doing this concept reopening of Texas that's really centered around public schools and higher education right now. And we're going to find out if we've had about 3 weeks of diminished count from what we can tell in actual new cases of COVID. We're going to find out whether that's going to hold when we start reintroducing some social systems into the state. We don't know. I mean, everybody's got a theory about it, but the fact is that we just don't know what's going to happen. That is as Dr. Fauci famously says, when he is allowed to do so, the virus is in charge of the timing, not us, right? We're in charge of actions. The virus does its thing, and then we figure out what's real, right? And so we're, open your newspaper, take a walk outside and talk to your neighbor, and all of you know that we are engaged in. That's a very high stress moment. I would pause and say every single one of us should offer material support in the form of conversation, prayer, and whatever else, a casserole, whatever else you think you can give to public school teachers and university educators, and that's both faculty and staff. It is really hard on them. I say this with a certain bias because as I said before, my wife is a department chair at the biggest high school in Austin. But she's exemplary of what's going on around Texas, which is an enormous amount of stress in that space, on that situation. And that what they find out, the data set that they make, is going to have an enormous material impact on what happens to all of the systems, including the legislative session, going forward into January. And we all wait. I am personally, I will tell you, against the experiment of doing this in a mandatory fashion with public schools, but it's an experiment nonetheless, and it's going to yield data that's going to be relevant to how I'm going to be doing my job between now and into the new year. The second thing is that if you take COVID and set it completely aside, we already had a lot of political disarray in Texas. That political disarray really manifested itself. It started last summer, about a little more than a year ago right now, and it consummated itself in October of 2019 when the Speaker of the House of Representatives said he's not going to run for the legislature again, but he's also not going to step down as Speaker. So Speaker Bonin is Speaker of the House, but everybody knows he's not going to be Speaker of the House as soon as the legislature convenes in 2021. And so that created an important sort of space of political division in the Republican Party, in the House of Representatives, in the House system generally. It created some real uncertainty about both the primary elections and the general election. We're through the primary, we're coming to the general. There is an open question about where Texas is in terms of its partisan vote, both for federal offices and for state offices here. You all are about to see something that you haven't seen in Texas in 20 years, which is political advertisements. Because Texas, for years and years, Texas has been an exporter of political dollars. The Republicans would raise money in Texas and then take it to states where they weren't sure they were going to win and didn't bother to spend it in Texas. The Democrats would raise money in Texas and take it to states where they had a chance. And so no longer is that the case. We're going to see a lot of political advertising all the way to the top of the ticket here in Texas. We already are. You're going to see a big ground game here in Texas. If you don't like people on your lawn or knocking on your door, too bad, because you're gonna see a lot of it. If you like it, good for you. Engage in many conversations, but we already have this enormous political uncertainty that is now being exacerbated, really fueled by COVID. And then the other thing that is both related directly to COVID, but also something that's just out there for us and has been out there for us, is the economic situation in Texas, where we already knew that we were going to have issues with the coming legislative session because we passed a public ed bill that people were scratching their heads saying, can we really pay for that? In the last legislative session. And in January, before we had any documented case of COVID in Texas, Saudi Arabia and Russia decided to commence economic hostilities with one another over oil production. And in so doing, drastically affected the oil patch in Texas and oil revenues in Texas. This is before the first COVID case in Texas. Then COVID happened and exacerbated all of that. So we know we're probably going to be something like $5 billion short on the current budget in Texas. And we're going to have an amount of revenue to work with in the next legislative session that, I don't know, because we don't know what an economic recovery may look like. We don't know if this thing is going to be persistent. Nobody can understand the stock market right now. If you are a voracious reader of analysis on the stock market, what you're seeing is most of the smartest people saying, we don't understand what's happening in the stock market right now. The days that it's good, we don't understand why people have any faith in it because we're not seeing those fundamentals in the economy. And yet there's this persistent optimism that's not underwritten by the fundamentals. And the question is, are we walking the plank, or will the fundamentals rise up to meet the weird optimism of the market? We don't know. All of this has an enormous impact on what you can do in the legislature if you need money to do stuff. So this sort of triple uncertainty of COVID itself, the ongoing political uncertainty in Texas, and the economic uncertainty that underpins the budget writing process, the budget reconciliation process, and the budget writing process. All three of those things are like 42 font red question marks on the imaginary PowerPoint that I'm showing you right now, because we just really don't know.
And
so
redistricting.
Well, yeah, and then the final thing. Thank you, Josh. Um, Here's how I know I'm old. I know I'm old because this is going to be my 4th actual redistricting. Yeah, see, Josh thinks I'm old.
Well, no, I was just thinking about like the non-linearness of a redistricting year when like it just gets so personal on top of the partisan, where 2 people of the same party are angry because one neighborhood got included or didn't get included, or one industry got thrown in or not thrown in, and trying to figure out why a bill got popped or knocked down or happened due to a completely unrelated redistricting issue is hard enough in a normal environment.
Right. Well, yeah, and just a quick comment on that, and then we'll get to sort of a short summation and your questions, which are the most important thing. We weren't sure that we were going to have redistricting this time because we weren't sure that we were going to be able to get census data. Mm-hmm. We're still not sure that we're going to get census data, but people say we're going to. So we are. So it appears that we are going to have our constitutionally mandated redistricting, or at least a swing at it, in 2021. And everything Josh is saying is exactly right. And think of that particularly in the context of if Republicans win the majority in the Texas politics generally, and in the Texas House of Representatives specifically, and remain in power, they've got this internal division that's really stark and getting starker. And so it's that's going to be a problem. If the Democrats win, what we're going to have essentially is counter gerrymandering, frankly, probably without very much grace and discipline, because there's a sense of oppression over the last 15 to 20 years related to how we've done redistricting. And so it's a big mess. And all of that says to me, I don't know, none of that dampens my basic enthusiasm and optimism about doing policy work in Texas. In fact, what it does is it makes me all giddy up go about getting into the policy stuff in Texas. This is going to be hard. But what I would say, what I again would say to any client, and what I say to you is when things externally are super chaotic, that's often kind of healthy for you, because what that means is the only rational act for you is to go to your fundamentals. And the people of faith who are on this webinar have the best fundamentals in the cosmos, frankly, informed by faith and by revelations from God. If you've got the best fundamentals and the rest of space is just chaos and you can't really chase and shape your principles to meet an expectation because you can't figure out what's going to happen, having your own internal fundamentals is really healthy and awesome. And you guys have them. So go to your fundamentals. Decide what's important to you, communicate that, and we will be however unready everybody in Texas is, we'll be more ready than everybody else.
Well, thank you, both of you. I'm going to go ahead and take so I'm going to try to make a couple of buckets here. One of them has to do, actually it goes right to what you were just saying, Beeman. So we've got a question. Jay Breeding says, what do you think the budget constraints are going to mean for the agenda and proposed bills? And I'm going to say we could think about that both in terms of Texas Impact's agenda and in what the live legislative agenda of the legislature is. And we could also look at what legislation Texas Impact is likely to prioritize, what legislation the legislature is likely to prioritize. So, I mean, I think, and there are several questions and comments that go to that basic idea of, again, how do we prepare? And maybe you could think about how do we center those fundamentals as we talk to who are perhaps not as centered and a little bit more bought into the chaos.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think the first answer is going to be a pessimistic answer. And that is that in sessions like this, I have already been told in no uncertain terms by several members of the legislature, you better not come to us with anything that costs money because the answer is already no. Right? That is not some sort of cosmic law. That's what they say to people so that they don't have a bunch of people coming asking for money that they're not sure if they've got it or not. And so the question is not whether or not you can spend money. There is certainly a rational question about if you go in with a $10 billion ask, whether they say, are you out of your mind, right? But there's also a question of if you come in and you say, as an example, COVID has illustrated how deeply vulnerable Texas is in terms of healthcare. We need to do something about healthcare, and it may cost you some money, but it's worth coming up with it, right? You have to be able to articulate your position in terms of what we've learned about Texas is where it's strong and where it's not strong. And we need to talk about strength, notwithstanding the tactical situation we're in economically. We need to be strategic about what we do, because we have learned some things about how vulnerable we really are in certain spaces, right? You can make these arguments. So I guess what I would say is there's going to be a hard crust of no on everything that takes money. And some of it is going to be like the crust of a nice piece of French bread. Some of it is going to be like a coconut husk and the shell underneath, right? But if you've got a policy argument, there's still something good in the middle of it. And so you might have to be persistent to make the policy argument. The chances are what the chances always are in getting something passed. I mean, it's difficult, but you shouldn't be, there are going to be a big set of immediate pushback no's in the session, and you've got to be ready to sort of weather that and say, I understand the pressure you're under, I understand the stresses of the session, but we can't stop talking about the long-term health of Texas. We can't just put that on hold. And that probably is an explanation for like 80% of what we're talking about in the context of social programs, social justice issues, things that we feel like we need to do.
Yeah, if I might add on those fundamentals, we've been saying for half a decade now, if at all possible, to ignore the national zeitgeist and focus on state and local. Again, that all politics is ultimately local. And I would say, looking at just Texas in 2020, I'm going to assume we're going to still have democracy in Texas in 2022, no matter what happens in November. And the elected officials in the state legislature do not know what their new districts are going to look like. And they do not know which way the political wind is blowing in Texas. The election, it takes about 2 or 3 or 4 election cycles to really see a good pattern, and it is a disruptive pattern. They won't be doing a whole lot of legislation, I don't think, given, I mean, I could be wrong about that, but regardless, the high uncertainty means that the voter is empowered the most, I think. And so you are actually, even though you may not feel like it's quarantined in your house on Zoom, probably in a better position, well, in an extremely strong position to be influential with a state house representative that represents 170,000 people, especially since they have no idea what their district is going to look like. Some of them are going to lose their district. Some of them are going to be drawn out of their districts. Some of them will have completely new looking districts with new voters. And so right now is a good time to continue to engage with them. You can have more influence than probably even a few years back.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that goes immediately to kind of the second set of questions that I think are coming up over and over here, which are um, kind of how constituents encounter legislators and how lawmakers encounter constituents. So, we've got a question here about is it more important to talk to local officials or more important to talk to state officials? Is it better to go in a group or is it better to go by yourself? Is it better to email or is it better to call? And I think all of those things, I mean, I'm going to take the privilege of moderating to say I'm going to give an answer to start with, and that is the one you do is the one that's the right one, right? So if you're not someone who habitually interacts with your member of Congress or your legislator, but you live next door to a city council person, maybe start with what's convenient for you. If it scares you to think about talking to a lawmaker with other people, talk to him by yourself. Or if it scares you to think about talking to him by yourself, go with a group. I mean, I think what I want to say, and then I'm going to turn it over to Beeman and Josh, and this is probably going to wind up our time together. Taxes Impact is here to help you do what you can do as well as you can do it. So if you want to do legislative visits, we've got opportunities for you. You can email any of us. You can go online. You've got forms online that'll say sign up here if you want to be part of a group that's meeting with legislators, if you want to talk to a legislator by yourself, if you want to make phone calls, we can provide the resource for you to do that. We send out our email once a week. If you don't get it, we hope that you'll register to get it. But the idea is not that there's one right way to do civic engagement, and if you just knew it, you could do it and then we'd all be hunky-dory. It's that the ways of doing civic engagement have to be as many as the ways there are of citizens. And that's as many people as there are in the country, as many voters as there are in the country. That's how many ways there are to engage the democracy. And I think Beeman's going to chime in and say, that's why democracy is so awesome.
Am I supposed to say democracy? I'm a monarchist, you know that. No, I mean, no, democracy is awesome, right? And B brings up the issue of levels of government, and this is really important. Like, this is important generally in the way the United States works, and it's very important in Texas today. As I mentioned before, my wife is the best teacher in Texas. Did I mention that before? It may or may not be true. Apologies to you all on the call who are teachers. But the fact is, my wife is trying to figure out how to go back to Bowie High School and teach social studies, to teach AP US History and Ethnic Studies at Bowie High School. And she is being affected by the local school board, who says, this is what we're going to do. She's being affected by the city of Austin, who says, this is what the health situation is in Austin. She's being affected by Travis County, who is, has issues related to catastrophe management and emergency management. She's being affected by the state through TEA and through the governor. And of course, through all of the laws associated with education that say kids have to be in school for a certain amount of time every year. And this is how schools get funded on daily, average daily attendance. How are we doing that? And she's being affected from the federal level by the President of the United States saying, if schools don't go to school, we're going to cut their funding, or what funding we give them at the federal level in the form of federal grants, etc. My wife said, she's a school teacher at Bowie High School. Every level of government that we can come up with in the United States of America is having a direct impact on her immediate future in her classroom, which means they're all fair game for you guys. So that's number one. The second thing, and I think that this is really important, and this is my opinion, so take it or leave it. There has been an attempt in Texas politics in a very particular way to divide and conquer levels of government. And what I mean specifically about that is that there are a set of bills in the legislature that seek to preempt local authority to do certain things. And because some of those bills have not been successful, there's also been a persistent number of bills in the legislature to prevent local governments from hiring a guy like me or from sending internal people who actually work for the local governments to the legislature to give the legislature opinions on the local impact of state legislation. And if you don't think that this is true, read the party platform out of the Republican Party in Texas, read the interim charges from the Senate, and read the interim charges from the House of Representatives. They all contemplate reducing the representation, disallowing lobbying by local governments at the state legislature. I strongly think that our system of government is predicated on the idea of all the levels of government working together, not standing in opposition, of listening, not silencing, of actually communicating with each other, because whoever you voted for, it's not like your vote for your state legislator was real smart and your vote for your city councilman was really stupid, right? Those votes should be equally important and should be equally important to you. And to the extent that you want your city council person or your school board member or whomever to be able to communicate the impact of state laws on your community to the legislature, that's a thing that's important. So the two things I would say is, one, to echo what B said, wherever you get into this deal, it's important. And two, if you see your way clear to do so, challenge those guys to work with all the other people and say, we are really interested in collaboration here, because I don't buy the divide and conquer thing. I think it's going to take a concerted, positive, constructive effort of all levels of government to get us through our current situation. And we cannot afford to waste one freaking calorie on infighting and division and conquest between levels of government or between partisan government. We just don't have the luxury of the extra resources for that kind of fighting. We really need to do this thing right.
Keep doing that. Josh, do you want to add anything before we wind it up? Nope. Well, you all, thank you so much for sticking with us to the end here. This is the last panel. We hope that you will, for one thing, go into the chat and find the link to the evaluation for this panel. If you attended all the panels, hopefully you're gonna do the evaluations for each of them. If you're interested in getting more involved with Texas Impact, as a member, we hope you'll go to texasimpact.org/join. If you'd like specifically to work more on election issues, please check out Texas Faith Votes on our website as well. And stay tuned, because we'll be doing more of these faith and democracy virtual conferences. We've got one coming up in Houston on September 13th. And just like I know there's people here today who don't live in the Dallas area, hopefully some of you who do will check out what the faith leaders and other local experts have to say in the Houston area next month. Thanks again, and thanks for the kudos in the chat. That means a lot to us. And Beeman and Josh, thanks for taking your time. And I think we're gonna sign off. So goodbye.